Also super excited about where we're going today, which is part 2 of our series, Would You, Could You, Won't You Be My Neighbor? That's right. So this has been a fun series so far. If you haven't gotten the Mr. Rogers reference yet, it really was just for me. If you were wondering, someone told me this week that I should put on a cardigan and then throw my shoes across the stage or something. And I was like, I went to a church where they did stuff like that growing up. You know, they threw all kinds of things around places. And I'm like, I don't think we want to be that kind of church. I don't know. So we're not going to do that this morning, right? But we're going to jump into this series on neighboring. And here's what we've said in this series right out of the gate. We said, hey, neighboring in our world in so many ways really is kind of a lost art, right? Like there was a day where if you needed a stick of butter, you walked across the street and you got a stick of butter. There was a day where if you needed, I don't know, some flour, you went over and you asked if you could borrow a cup of flour. I don't remember those days. Some of you remember those days. Many of you have told me about those days, right? But there was a day when neighboring was a thing that just happened. It was normal. It was weird if you didn't know your neighbors, right? But over time, neighboring, we've said neighboring has kind of become a lost art, right? But it actually is still at the very heart of the way of Jesus. In fact, Jesus, when he spent his time on earth and was sharing kind of what it looked like to live in his ways on our earth, Jesus, very early on in his ministry, found himself in an argument with some religious leaders about like what it looked like to follow Jesus or follow God, like what it looked like to like kind of live out the ways of God's kingdom in our world. And someone stood up in the middle of that argument and they looked at Jesus and they asked him a question. They said, Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? Of all the commandments that Moses has given us as Jews, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus didn't pause, he didn't hesitate, he just said, hey, this. He said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. And I'm like, that's great. Makes a lot of sense. Love God. Good commandment. Of course, God would say, love God. Kind of, adds up there. Good word, Jesus, right? And then Jesus keeps talking, though. And this is where things get complicated, because Jesus doesn't stop there at that period. He keeps going, and he says the second commandment, the second is this, to which I would have been like, Jesus, like nobody asked you what the second commandment was, like the first one, that's good. Let's just start with one. Let me work on that for a while. When I finish the first assignment, I'll come back and ask you for the second assignment. How's that? And Jesus goes, no. The second commandment is so intertwined with the first commandment that you can't separate these two. And if you want the first, you have to also have the second. He says the second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. As if to say, the way in which you might know how much you love God is reflected in the ways that you might choose to love your neighbor. Now, there's a difficulty that I have with all of this, and it's simply this. You've probably experienced it too, right? My neighbors are nothing like myself, And so if I'm supposed to love my neighbor, like I know how to love myself. I've spent 36 years getting to know myself. I can love myself just fine. I know myself real well, but my neighbors are nothing like myself, and so how am I supposed to love my neighbor in that way? I was thinking this week about the neighbors that Emily and I have had over the years. I was thinking 7 years ago when we bought our first house. We bought our first house in Georgia, a little town called Dalton, Georgia. We moved in to the house, and one morning shortly after we moved in, I walked out on my porch with a cup of coffee in my hand, and I looked right next door to me, and I saw my new neighbor on his porch. And I immediately knew that he and I probably had very little in common. It was evident. You know me a little bit, right? Like I don't know, I'm pretty vanilla, standard, plain, basic, right? Like I'm gonna wear the same button-down shirt, some version of the same button-down shirt every day, a pair of jeans every day, 515s every day, you know what I mean? Like I'm gonna wear the same thing every day. I look over my neighbor, I'm not sure my neighbor owned clothes. You know what I mean? Like, you ever have a neighbor who didn't own clothes? Like I looked over, I'm like, I don't know if we have anything. It just looks like a Hanes commercial gone wrong over there. Like something's going on with Randy on his porch. And I found myself like going, I know how to love me, but I don't know how to love all that. You know what I mean? Like I don't know what to do in that moment. Or I thought about how we moved from there to an apartment in Columbus, Ohio. We were church planning at the time. Felt like we needed to kind of downsize our finances, so we moved into an apartment. We had a young kid, so we said, hey, we don't want to carry her upstairs all the time, so we moved into the bottom floor apartment, which is never a good decision to do, you know what I mean? But we said we're going to move into the bottom floor apartment. And Addie, our daughter at the time, she was about 3, Addie every day took a nap at about 2 o'clock. And every day at about 2 o'clock, we didn't know what was going on, but it felt like a herd of elephants all of a sudden woke up right above us. Every day at 2 o'clock. It was clockwork. Addie would go to nap. heard of elephants. I would go to nap, heard of elephants, over and over and over again. Then we moved here, right? And when we moved here to Minnesota, we moved first into an Airbnb because we wanted to take some time to find a house. And so we moved into an Airbnb right here in Forest Lake, just like 3 minutes from here. And we started living there. And the neighbor right next to us, it was a little townhouse, and the neighbor in the townhouse right next to us never really made eye contact, never really said much more than one word. If you said hi, you get a quick wave. You know what I mean? Like we would shovel, there were days, we would shovel our entire driveways at the same time. And there wasn't a conversation in that moment. He was a lot faster than I was at shoveling his driveway. He had a year's or a life worth of experience. I had none. You know what I mean? But he knew it was, but we never actually had any exchanges. But then there were a few times where I would be away late at night. I'd be at a meeting or something like that, and about 8 o'clock at night, after the sun's gone down, it's dark, Emily would call me and say, hey, somebody's ringing our doorbell, and I think it's our neighbor. And I'm like, don't answer it. Whatever you do. You know what I mean? Flip the lights out, whatever. Don't answer it. You've been in those moments. You know, I'm like, I don't care if his house is on fire. Don't answer the door. It happened multiple times. You know, you ring the doorbell, and I'm like, what are you doing now? You want to talk at 8 p.m. Why are you, it didn't feel comfortable, and I'm not there both times, right? And so we find these times, you've had these moments, right, with neighbors, where you go I don't really feel like we are on the same page. I don't feel like loving you would be anything like loving myself, because you and myself have nothing in common. And you have enough of these experiences, and quite honestly, I would just say this, for most of us, we start to realize that we don't really want neighbors. I mean, you have neighbors, you get neighbors, they come with the house, right? You really can't not have neighbors unless you buy a ton of land, right? For most of us, you have to have neighbors, but you don't actually buy the house because you wanted neighbors. They just came with it, right? You don't want neighbors. What you want is friends. What you actually want are people who you can grow close with, right? What you actually want are people who hold things in common with you. What you actually want are people who relate to you. What you actually want are people you can trust, right? What you actually want are people who want to talk to you. What you actually want are people you can rely upon. What you actually want is someone you can call at 2 a.m. when everything breaks down and when life is at its worst. What you actually want is someone who can meet you for coffee at the snap of a finger in a moment's notice because you know that they care for you. What you actually want is not a neighbor. What you actually want is friendship, right? But the reality is, and you know this, you live in the world the same way I do, right? The reality is, right, finding friends, quite honestly, is harder today than it's ever been. I mean, you study any research on this, read any paper, do any search you want to do, right? You're going to find that finding friends in our world continues to get harder, and you don't need research to tell you that because you've already discovered that to be true. Now, there's some interesting thoughts about this. In fact, I came across something recently. Somebody shared something with me by an author named Jenny Allen, who had some thoughts on this topic that, quite honestly, when I read them, I thought were just fascinating. She just kind of unpacked what I feel like we experience in so many ways, to a T and so well. Here's what she said. She said, hey, all of us in our life, we have acquaintances, right? We have people who we are acquaintances with. People you know, people you see, people you bump into, people that you kind of go through the same checkout line, you kind of go through the same spot to pick up your kids in the line, right? Or you kind of see your neighbor, right, closing their garage door. Or you have these acquaintances in life, people we just casually interact with or bump into, or at least are aware of, right? Time and time again, right? And she says, when it comes to relationships, the next stage of relationships is to actually craft what she calls a village, or what I might even say are neighbors, right? Not just neighbors in your neighborhood, though that counts too, but neighbors, people who you share life with in so many different spaces of life, right? To craft a village, or to craft neighbors, or even a neighborhood, right? To have intentional relationships, or just to start conversations, right? To actually know people a little bit more than maybe their first name, right? To have some level of relationship and connection with them. She says you can have about 50 or so people in your village, right? Or who you might consider neighbors, people who you see on a regular basis, people you're aware of, people who you have some level of connection with. And then she says that over time, people from that village or people from those lists of neighbors, right, actually become for you, 2 to 5 close friends, right? 2 to 5 people who you find that you can actually trust, 2 to 5 people who you actually lean into and do life with. Now, here's what Jenny says that I think is so fascinating. She says, all of us want this, right? We want close friendship. But she says we avoid a village and we avoid our neighbors. And when we avoid relationships at this level, we actually never get the proximity required to move relationships to the next level. And so we want close friends, but we actually avoid any level of like medium or intermediate or casual relationship and connection with the people around us. Now why, right? Why do we do that? Right? For many of us, it's because we've lived long enough to know that it's risky. We've lived long enough to know that sometimes, like, you reach out to somebody, right? You make an invitation, you extend, a branch to someone, you start a conversation, and they might reject you, right? Like, they might actually push you away. Or some of us, like, you've lived life long enough to know that they might actually say yes to that. And in saying yes to that, you might actually get a little bit closer to them. And then in time, they might actually hurt you. They may not actually be there when you want them to be there. They may not actually show up when you need them to show up. They may not actually say the right thing in the right moment. And they might actually create pain in your life. And so because of that, we hesitate to send that text message that we've thought about drafting in our minds so many times to invite someone or to reach out to someone. We hesitate to talk to them at the ball field or to ask another question that might move the conversation just one layer deeper. We hesitate to put ourselves just a little bit closer to them because we know, experience tells us that there are two ways that might go. One, they might reject us, or two, they might not reject us, and in doing so, in time, they might end up hurting us. And so many of us, right, we want close friendship, but we actually avoid the relationships that are currently closest to us at this time. Now, there's another piece that I would add to Jenny's framework that I was thinking about this week. I think is important. I think for many of us, not all of us, but for some of us, right? Because we don't find community here, because we hesitate at this level, we revert back and we find our deepest community and our deepest relationships with family, right? Not just your immediate family, but sometimes even your extended family. And I think that's normal, that's understandable because it's what we know, right? Because it's known to us, because we've done 36 or whatever your number is, years worth of life with them, right? We know how to interact with them. We know how to navigate those relationships. We know how to like create some level of protection for ourselves in those moments. But here's what I just say about that, right? It's not that family comes with no risk. It's just that it's a known risk. And you know the ways that they could hurt you. And you know the things to do to prevent yourself from being in the situations where they might hurt you. And those things that you do to prevent that pain doesn't actually allow for a deep relationship there either. It just creates a safe space, right? And a safe relationship, which is good, and which is, like, that's, in many ways, it's positive, right? But it doesn't come as a substitute to close friendship, right? And you found over the years, right, those people aren't perfect either. You just know how to navigate those relationships perfectly for the sake of protecting yourself, right? Well, let's just acknowledge that it's not a substitute for the thing that we want most, but for many of us feel like we could never actually have, which all leads us to a question that I think is worth asking, right? Which is simply this: what does it actually take to find close friends? What's it actually take to find people that we can do deep life with? Now, when it comes to questions like this, I think it's worth looking at the way that Jesus lived his life and the ways that he engaged with the relationships around him and asking ourselves, hey, what might we learn from that? I think one of the things that we can look at right out of the gate is ask ourselves, who did Jesus actually choose to spend the most time with, and who did Jesus actually choose to allow into his life and have relationships with? Now, the Gospel of Mark tells us right out of the gate that Jesus, very early in his time on earth and his adult life, appointed 12 people to be disciples, people who would follow closely with him, people who he would do the most life with. And so the author tells us that Jesus appointed the 12, and he tells us who those 12 were. He says that it was Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, right? Now, Peter was known, if you read throughout the text, you'll find that Peter, right, was kind of the guy who never really had a filter for anything that he said. He always spoke his mind. He always spoke before he thought. You ever known anyone who spoke before they thought? You ever looked at anyone who spoke before they thought, right? And Mark goes on, he says that Jesus also appointed James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James. I love this. To whom Jesus gave the name Boanerges. He gave these two brothers a nickname, Boanerges, which means sons of thunder, right? Like if that doesn't sound like WWE, I don't know what does. The Sons of Thunder are here. The reason he gives them this nickname is because they're so loud and so passionate about everything that they do that they just sound like thunder rumbling in. You know what I mean? Like just those Sons of Thunder. The author goes on, he tells us that Jesus appointed Andrew, he appointed Philip, he appointed Bartholomew. Bartholomew, interestingly, was condescending towards Jesus' hometown just before he met Jesus. Like he hadn't even met Jesus, and he was being condescending toward Jesus, right? He appoints Matthew, who's a tax collector. Now, tax collectors in this day were known for like constantly taking from people more than they were required to take for the sake of their own profit, right? They're taking advantage of people constantly. Jesus appoints Thomas, who is super skeptical of Jesus in a couple of moments, right? He appoints Simon, we'll go Thaddeus, and he appoints Simon the Zealot. This is fun. Zealots at the time were political activists. The Roman Empire had control of Israel at the time, and the Zealots were trying to take back their region from the Roman Empire. So he's this political activist with like these very strong ideals about what things should look like, right? And he goes on to appoint Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Judas literally was the manager of Jesus' money, carried the coin purse, and constantly was taking coins from the purse for the sake of his own benefit. And so Jesus, very early in his adult life, choosing who he's going to spend his time with, pulls together, right? Someone with no filter, the Sons of Thunder, who just make noise constantly, right? People who are condescending, right? Someone who's taking advantage of other people, a corrupt accountant, and a political activist. If this doesn't look like your neighborhood, okay? I want to know where you live. Okay? Yet these are the people who Jesus chooses to do the most life with. And not just them. He also chooses to engage with the people who associate themselves with them, and that list gets even worse. In fact, at one point, Matthew had just begun to follow Jesus, and Matthew, as a tax collector, invites Jesus to a party at his own house with all the people that Matthew knows. The problem is that Matthew's a tax collector, and nobody wants to hang out with tax collectors because they take advantage of people. And so the only people that Matthew knows are other tax collectors, and what the text calls just like sinners. Like, doesn't even give us any more detail, just like the worst, right? Sinners, they were called scum, you know what I mean? Like, he pulls all of them together and invites Jesus to this dinner, and Jesus comes, and he shows up, and he sits down with them, right? The text tells us that Jesus reclined at table in Matthew's house, and behold, many tax collectors and sinners came. They were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. Jesus isn't hanging out in, like, the other room. You ever been to a party, and you're like, you know what? I'm going to hang out in the dining room while all your friends hang out in the living room, or like a few of us are going to just like kind of hang out in the back porch because like, I don't know if I want to like hang out with those people, right? No, Jesus and his disciples are sitting right down on the floor with these people. And when the Pharisees, right, the most respected religious leaders at the time, when the Pharisees, right, saw this, they said to Jesus' disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Like, they don't even understand it. And Jesus is putting his own reputation at stake because of the people that he's choosing to associate himself with and the friends of the people that he's choosing to associate himself with. Now, from this moment, Jesus and these 12 men begin to journey throughout Israel. And Jesus begins to proclaim these radical ideas that some people get really excited about and some people just do not understand and like feel contrary to completely. And they go from town to town, at times being ridiculed, at times being rejected, at times being disdained, right? At times being attacked, at times being told, you can't come here. And after 3 years of journeying and doing life together, 3 years of experiencing hardship and frustration together, 3 years of walking together from town to town, to space, from hard conversation to hard conversation, Jesus recognizes that he's nearing the end of his life. And he pulls together these 12 men for one last final meal. A meal that most often would have been shared not with friends, but with family. And he pulls them together. And over this meal, he looks at them. Over this meal, he looks at the tax collector. He looks at the one who's had no filter everywhere they've gone. He looks at the one, right, who makes noise constantly. He looks at the one who is condescending to him before he even knew him. He looks at all of them. And he says, No longer do I call you servants. In other words, there was a time and a moment where our relationship looked one way. And it had a little bit more distance to it. It had a little bit more clarity to it. No longer do I call you servants. It says, for the servant does not know what his master is doing. He said, but you've been with me all along the way. We've experienced things together. He says, but I have called you friends. Not servants, but friends. For all that I have heard from my Father, I have made known to you. In other words, everything that I have, every thought, every perspective, I've given and shared with you. He says, you did not choose me, but I chose you. So I made a choice to connect with you. I made a choice to do life with you. He says, and I appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give it to you. And what might that fruit look like? He says, these things I command you, so that you will love one another. So to say, in the same way that I've pulled you close, I made a choice to do life with you. Now it's time for you to do the same with each other. Within hours of those words, Judas, the friend who had stolen money from him over and over again, betrayed him and turned him in to have him led to his own execution. Peter, the one who spoke before he thought, disowned Jesus in his own presence multiple times. And every other of those friends scattered and hid themselves and protected themselves in the greatest moment of Jesus' life as he made his way to the cross. If there's anything that we can learn from the ways that Jesus engaged in relationships, if there's anything that we can learn from the ways that Jesus pulled people towards him, I think it's this. First, that friendship is an intentional choice. Jesus said, I chose you. It doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't just pop up. People don't just show up. Right? In the same way that Jesus leaned in and actually made a choice to engage the people around him in relationship and friendship. If we want to experience that in our life, we have to make that choice as well. Second is this, though, that pain, we have to acknowledge that pain is actually a part of the process. There is no friendship without pain. There is no close without getting too close and getting hurt. And in the same way that Jesus was betrayed, the same way that Jesus had people take more from him than he gave to them in times, it felt like, right? Like in the same way that he was disowned by them, you will have friends who take more from you than you give to them. You'll have friends who disown you. You'll have friends who it feels like have betrayed you. You know what? You'll do the same to them. So if we're ever going to step into friendship, if we're going to ever allow ourselves to have those relationships that we actually want most, we have to expect, and I would even say accept, the fact that pain is a part of the process. And so also, forgiveness actually has to be a part of the process. You know, Jesus died and he was resurrected. The others tell us about his life after his resurrection. He went back to those same friends. He showed up there again to them. Do you know what he said about the ways that they scattered, the ways that they ran, the ways that they disowned him in his hardest moment? You know what he said about that? Nothing. Nothing. Pain is a part of the process. So if we're going to have friendship, forgiveness has to be a part of the process as well. And the last thing is this, all of it. If we're going to have close friendships, all of it starts with neighboring. It starts with casting a wide net before you're sure if you even want to cast that net, or if you're ready to cast that net. It starts with creating space in your life for people who you're not so sure about, but also haven't had the chance yet to become sure of. It's about starting first, stepping in first, sending that text message first, making that invitation first, opening up your life, not just to close friendship, but to the people around you, and discovering what's actually going on inside of them and actually discovering how you might connect with them. Right? Starts with inviting them over. It starts with moving the fire pit from the backyard to the front yard. It starts with going to the neighborhood park instead of playing on the swing set in the backyard. It starts with sitting closer to them on the bleachers at the game rather than just giving them a little bit of space. It starts with asking one more question that you're not sure you're ready to ask. It starts with making an invitation and creating space in your life for them, even before you've actually gotten to know them. That neighbor back in Dalton, Georgia, who was very different from me. As we continued to live there, you know what I found out? We had very little in common. Very little. But boy, he knew how to take care of a lawn. He knew how to answer every question that I had about how to take care of that or kill that or make that go away and never come back again. Right? And we found ourselves in the driveway so many times with conversations that I would have never expected us to have at first. His wife was going through like a serious illness that she couldn't figure out. Right? And we didn't connect on fashion, that's for sure. But there was something deeper that we actually found ourselves connecting on. Those neighbors in Columbus who sounded like a herd of elephants at 2 p.m., you know what we found out? There were 2 middle school kids who lived upstairs. And in the middle of COVID, their Taekwondo class got moved from in-person to online. And it happened every day at 2 p.m. And we started talking with them. They were here on a work visa from the Middle East. We didn't eat the same food. We didn't say the same things. We didn't believe the same things. We had so many differences. But those 2 middle school kids were some of the best friends my little girl had the whole time we lived there. They would stop for her every time she got out of the car. They would wait for her to say hi and connect with her. She would run upstairs and she'd join that herd of elephants and we'd hear her, right, going back and forth. Oh man, there was so much we didn't have in common, but there was so much more and so much better that we had in common. That neighbor at the Airbnb who never talked to me while we were shoveling snow and kept ringing the doorbell when I wasn't home at 8 p.m. at dark. The last night we were in that Airbnb, we just bought our house, we were packing the truck. The last night we were in that Airbnb, I was running stuff from the house to the car, to the house, to the car. And he was out there the whole time. He was in the driveway. He was standing around with a fire pit. And I walked over and I started talking to him. You know what I realized? Those times he kept ringing the doorbell after dark, he didn't know I wasn't home. He just wanted to stand around the fire. When we started talking, I found out that he also was house hunting, just like me. Except he is separated from his kid's wife, or kid's mom. And he found himself strapped between child support and is making what he can and all the bills that he already has. And house hunting in what felt like to me was a hard market to house hunt in was even harder for him in that moment. He looked at some of the houses I was aware of, right? And I realized in that moment, he wasn't trying to bug me at 8 p.m. He just wanted to have a fire. So let me ask you this as we wrap up. When you think about the people in your life right now, when you think about the people who are acquaintances in this moment, when you think about the people who you brush past or move past so quickly, right? Is there anyone you're saying no to before you've gotten to know them? Is there anybody you've already decided isn't worth connecting with or couldn't be a connection for you? Is there anyone you're not creating space for? Is there anyone you're jumping off the Zoom call as soon as it's over? Right? Is there anybody you're brushing past? Is there anybody you're not making eye contact with on the street? Anybody you're not stopping for? Is there anybody who you've already decided, whether consciously or subconsciously, that you're not going to ask one more question? Is there anybody who you're not going to sit near at the game? Is there anybody you're saying no to before you've gotten to know them? Perhaps it's time to be their neighbor. And perhaps you might find that you don't have a whole lot in common right here, but you just might find that you have something better in common. Let's pray together. God, I thank you for the ways that you sent your son to us to model for us what it looks like to pull people close, step towards the lives of others. God, for those of us who find ourselves looking for deeper friendship, God, would you give us the courage to go first? God, would you help us to step towards the people in our life who we're not so sure yet if we should step towards them or if we want to step towards them or what might happen if we did? God, would you help us to let go of things in our life that have created pain or hurt and a narrative that tells us that it's not worth the step or there's too much at risk to take it? God, would you give us the courage to step forward? God, would you also help us to know you as the ultimate source of community and love and acceptance in our life? Would you let our relationships with others be an outflow of the relationship that we already have with you? We love you. We thank you for this. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.